right. Well, good morning, everybody. This is Jomo Stewart here at the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. It's Tuesday, September 28th in the 2021, about 8 a.m. in the morning. And we have our Energy for Alaska Task Force meeting, our Tuesday morning task force meeting for today. Our guests are Mr. Jim Johnsen, Jim Johnsen has a deep resume, former president of the university, though, his last big job. And then we also have a Mr. Sam Enoka, a true local boy makes good story, here to give us an insight into his proposal for his new company. I don't want to steal any of his thunder. So as always, just know we do have the chat line open. I'm looking at it now, but of course, you may also, if you have any questions as we proceed, just go ahead and take yourself off mute and fire away. All right, with no further ado, Mr. Enoka.
Awesome, thanks. Well, just by way of background, some of you may already know me, but I was born here in Fairbanks, grew up here, went to UAF undergrad, played my basketball at Eielson. So, I've born and bred, but I've been living down in San Francisco for the last 22 years. So I got my MBA at Berkeley and decided to hang around the Bay Area to kind of partake in the world of, .com and tech and finance. And it's been an interesting journey. The last 15 years, I've been involved in the physical electricity markets. So doing grid operations for all the new wind farms and solar plants and natural gas plants and geothermal plants that have been coming online in California. So kind of had a front row seat to the adoption of renewables throughout California and most of the West over the last 15 years. So got to learn a lot about all the complexities of bringing all those assets to the grid. And we started Greensparc 5 years ago to focus on the intersection of energy markets and data infrastructure. And as you can imagine, the number one operating cost for a data center is energy. And, depending on who you listen to, the problem is big, the challenge is big, and it's only getting bigger. So data centers around the world consume about 10% of the world's electricity. And it's just got a voracious appetite. The internet's growing. Every day we're hooking up new iPhones, new iPads, new devices that's generating more data traffic and just generating an incredible amount of increasing demand for data infrastructure. Over the next 5 to 10 years, 100,000 megawatts of new data infrastructure is going to be added globally. That'll be a $5 trillion industry. But the key here is that it's not going to be centralized in the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples and the Microsofts of the world. The next 100,000 megawatts of data infrastructure needs to be distributed. It needs to go live at the edge. Figuratively, it needs to be at the edge of the network. There's more work happening at the edge of the network. So this data infrastructure needs to move closer to where those workloads are. Literally, that also means it needs to move to the edge of the world. Hence, this is why I'm back in Alaska. From my seat in San Francisco, we've been engaged up here in Alaska, and with help from partners like Jim Johnsen here, we've been talking to a lot of stakeholders across Alaska, but we've also been talking to stakeholders across the country that have similar rural areas and little to no data infrastructure. So believe me, I can empathize with the pain of not having great internet services across Alaska. That's prevalent in places like Alabama and Virginia and Michigan, in rural communities that are unserved or underserved. So our strategy of bringing better data infrastructure to the edge really applies globally. But if we know that if we can accomplish it in Alaska, then for sure we can do it anywhere in the world. So really happy to be here. Happy that you guys are taking the time today to learn a little bit about what we're doing. You want to work the slides?
All right. Can everybody see this? We're good. Thanks, Lisa. Okay.
Hopefully that'll work. Yeah, perfect.
You may.
Perfect. Thanks.
Here it goes.
So we're doing it faster, cheaper, and greener. And what that means is we're able to deploy our assets. We're targeting 90 days or less. So that's faster. Cheaper. We're doing it cheaper than the Amazons and the Googles of the world, and we're doing it cleaner. And that's where I think you guys are going to have the most appreciation for what we're doing. In our model, we're partnering with independent power producers and utilities across the country. Our goal is to deploy micro data centers at power plants. That has several efficiency impacts ultimately for the customers and the users of these assets. What it means is, as you guys know, by parking our data centers at power plants, we eliminate transmission and distribution. And depending on which market you're in, that eliminates about half the bill for the delivery of energy. Instead of moving electrons, we're moving data, we're moving photons. So, by saving 10% energy or saving 10% of the physical energy, that's great. By saving 50% of the cost of that energy, that's a real big impact. And that is a major milestone for the delivery of data infrastructure, which allows us to say, hey, we can now offer these kinds of assets in service at prices that are a fraction of the Amazons and the Googles and the Microsofts of the world, thereby enabling us to say, hey, we really are bridging the digital divide. As I mentioned, 100,000 megawatts are coming online, and it can't be done centrally. It needs to be done in a distributed fashion. And that model has to change from the Amazons of the world that are spending, up to $15 million per megawatt hour of data capacity to build and deploy. That costs in a time frame sense, it costs 2 to 4 years to get that in the ground. And they're building not 1 megawatt at a time, they're building 100 to 500 megawatt data centers at a time. That's really not sustainable to fuel the future growth of the internet at the edge. As I mentioned, cheaper, faster, and cleaner on an operating savings basis, up to 80% lower costs of operations. Up to 40% decrease in the total cost of ownership of data infrastructure. As I mentioned, our model is micro, scalable, and modular and prefabricated in design. And we're using open standards. So that means we're tuning up our supply chain to be able to put our assets to work again in as little as 90 days, less even if we have existing infrastructure to go into. And our secret sauce, if you will, is that we're offering 100% real-time energy transparency into the fuel mix of all of our assets. And that's something that is unique. So the large hyperscale data centers will always claim, hey, we're 100% solar, or we're 100% wind, or we're 100% renewable. And I still have to laugh because they're achieving that, as you probably know, through the trade of RECs and carbon offsets. In our model, we know exactly our fuel type, and we're willing to report it to the stakeholders that it matters most to. And in addition to that, we're reducing total energy usage, as well as eliminating the waste of excess water usage in our assets. So real key elements as data infrastructure unfolds over the next 10 years. Again, we kind of like to think of our assets as ESG optimized, and that's a term you guys might have heard recently, but
no. Please explain.
So ESG is the movement towards more transparency around environmental issues, social governance, social issues, and governance. And in data, governance has ruled the day. Latency, SLAs, the performance of your applications, where your data lives, data sovereignty, the governance of data operations has always ruled the day. But over the last 5 years, what we've been seeing is a greater focus on environmental issues and energy efficiency, more talk about renewables and using renewable energy, reducing waste in the supply chain, reducing water usage. So environmental issues are becoming more important to this community, to the community of the internet. And then you're starting to see a lot of folks start to think about the social impact of these assets. And so you'll see that later in our presentation, we have a high focus right now on social impact through providing service to higher education. So we've been in talks with Internet 2, which is the higher education backbone for the country, but also serves a constituents of higher ed, R1 and R2 institutions across the country. And you're starting to see a real demand for data infrastructure assets, cyber infrastructure assets on campus and in their communities, because the kids that are graduating from those schools need to have their hands on those assets to be able to work with the newest technology so that they're prepared for the new digital workforce that they're entering. And the kids that don't have access to those kinds of assets for workforce development and training purposes are at a disadvantage relative to their peers at other schools. So that's one reason why today I'll be up at the university, continuing my discussion with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but why we're also talking to other universities across the country about how Greensparc can help bring these kinds of assets to partner with their universities and the utilities in their community.
Would it be untimely to ask after the water usage? I think I understand well, as you go through the presentation and tell more about the actual, what you're talking about.
Sure.
On the scalability basis. I know we'll get into things like energy efficiency, carbon content, but what's the story on water?
Well, if you sort of read what's going on in the news with the big hyperscale players, and when I say hyperscale, I'm referring to Amazon Web Services, which is the 800-pound gorilla in our space, Google, Microsoft, Facebook. They run the largest data centers in the world, and they waste millions of, well, I won't say waste, but they use millions of water annually through their cooling system. In our deployment, in our microsystems, we take one water charge and we have a chiller, and we do not we don't use water. We recycle it in a closed system.
Oh, so it's not just in the energy generation.
That's right.
Component. It's in the actual.
Yeah. So in the environmental category, when we say we're ESG optimized, we're optimizing across these dimensions of environment, social impact, and governance. But in the environmental category, in addition to just being energy efficient and reducing energy costs, we're reducing water usage. We're also there's a term up here on the slide, responsible supply chain. So we're working with vendors of IT equipment and computation that are actually breaking down older components that are being basically disposed of by larger hyperscale players and using that componentry to generate new equipment. So it's the idea of circularity in the supply chain and actually recycling old goods. And it actually also serves to lower the total cost of ownership, lowers the cost of that equipment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Again, I will repeat, I'll note, because Sam's driving the bus on the mouse, I can't actively monitor the chat like I usually would. So please, again, I'll just let everybody know, if you have any questions, please just feel free to unmute and fire away.
So here's a great example. And if you can see the bar all the way out to the right, what's key about our deployment here is that, again, we're doing 1 megawatt deployments. That was our base design. Look, as an energy guy, it was a round number for us to work around. But in talking with, say, GCI or ACS about a very rural deployment, say in Nome or Kotzebue or Bethel, we would do a lot less than 1 megawatt. We can do as low as 50 kilowatt increments, but we can do 1 megawatt in 1,000 square feet, whereas it would take an Amazon or Facebook 10,000 square feet to service that same megawatt. So we're also actually we're densifying our computation into a smaller real asset footprint, which speaks to the speed at which we can get in the ground. If we have 1,000 square foot concrete pad, we can bring in our modular building, tilt up 4 walls, roll in our gear, bolt it down, and we're in the game. Arctic engineering notwithstanding, and I believe I have an appreciation for that. When we're looking around the grid in the lower 48, our goal is 90 days, and of course that's a little more standard engineering. But what's key about this, the takeaway from this slide here, we've already talked about cost and time to market. There's a factor here called power utilization effectiveness, and we've all in the data world, we focus a lot on the energy efficiency of a data operation, and that's measured through this factor called PUE. PUE is a ratio which is expressed as a number that's 1.0 or greater, but a PUE of 2.0, for instance, means that 1.0 of your energy usage is being dedicated to your IT equipment, with the other 1.0 being dedicated to the cooling operation of that equipment. A 1.05 is much more efficient. It means that 1.0 of your energy is being dedicated to IT, and the 0.05 is being dedicated to cooling. So most hyperscale operations are operating at 1.01 to 1.05. Your typical standard IT closet in your small, medium business around Fairbanks, around Anchorage, around the country, around the world operates around 2.5. So that means for every kilowatt that you're burning running servers, you're burning 1.5 kilowatts to keep it cool. Very inefficient. So our setup is designed to run at hyperscale levels, but be able to be deployed in very small increments. That's groundbreaking in this model.
So
Sam,
oh, please.
I do have a question, and I notice Greer is on the line, and he's on the statewide broadband initiative. I'm with Minto, and we are working on broadband deployment as well, with all of the money the federal government is putting in for tribes and such. So as I'm thinking of workforce development, a slide or two back, and then I'm looking at this, this slide here, the social, and then the technical aspects about what you're just saying, the physical dimensions of this. How cost effective is it for workforce development? If we get broadband into an area, we're still working on the energy component, and you put your little building in there, and say we bring a manufacturer into the village that may need computational requirements that you would provide. How does this really factor in the real world? And maybe it's too technical at this moment, but on the big scale, how would this work in rural Alaska?
A great question, and that's something that we're exploring right now. In fact, last week when I was at GCI, we were having this conversation about if we go to one of their local exchange carrier offices in rural Alaska, and we need to deploy these kinds of assets, like what's the benefit? What's the social impact? The benefit for the community is that I would posit that you're improving service and lowering costs. I hope GCI doesn't want to kill me for saying that, because they have a business decision to make about are they going to pass these savings on? My hope would be they are. But there, you can think about that broadband link from that village back to the backbone, whether it's Anchorage or Fairbanks. They're by deploying assets at the end of that fiber in the village, they're creating they're building an asset that's going to do the computational work there, rather than move data back to Fairbanks or Anchorage, or heaven forbid, all the way back to Seattle over that very costly subsea link. So as the topology of the network, as the topology of the internet is evolving, and as we add more technology in these rural communities, the demand for work at the edge is increasing. And if we can cache content, if we can host the applications themselves out at the edge, that makes that valuable link a little lighter on that load, but better for better service ultimately for the village and for the broadband provider as well. So it's an important addition to the network, and that's part of what's going to be driving change over the next 5 to 10 years.
So keep in mind that the ownership of the cables, like fiber or the microwave or so forth, maybe in some regards changing over to Anchorage Village corporations or the tribes themselves. Doyon is working on a much bigger project to connect more of the Yukon River communities. We just have a 4-village connection, but we'll be leasing this out to some of these big carriers. So at least if it goes as we hope. So your conversations hopefully will devolve down to some of us smaller providers that might be more nimble in being able to provide discounts to consumers, because our mandate by the federal government is to have 2510 at $100 or less a month per user. So this hopefully is going to translate into a lot of workforce development and hopefully a lot of economic development.
That's an excellent point. So last week I spent a day in Cordova with Clay Copland, the head of the utility, and also Jeremiah Beckett, the head of Cordova Telecom, both co-ops. And as you guys know, I don't need to tell you, Clay is also the mayor, and so they're they have a really good handle on their community and the businesses in their community and the needs, their needs, but also, I sat with Clay for several hours and we talked through the different use cases for the 20 years of 1 second interval data for the 1,000 points across his microgrid. And he's telling me about, hey, Sandia National Labs wants this data. ASEP wants this data. Pacific Northwest National Labs wants this data. ABB, the battery manufacturer for their battery storage unit, wants access to the data from the operation of the battery. So there are several use cases that support putting infrastructure in Cordova at the end of their fiber, as opposed to moving those huge data sets out of Cordova over to Valdez across the backbone down to an AWS. And that's just one, right? But what I'm learning about every community that I visit is there's a need. There's a use case that supports the telecom saying, hey, we could use a cabinet or two because we're trying to get off of our old voice switches and go to voice over IP, and we need digital equipment. And rather than spend the X, tens or hundreds of thousands to upgrade their rural building for, state-of-the-art HVAC units to cool to cool this infrastructure, our cabinets wheel in and bolt down and we're in business. And it gives them more space. It gives them physically a denser operation so that they can expand their operation without necessarily, buying new real estate or investing in new space. And it gets it done quickly. So the rural application for this is really fantastic. And your point about being nimble, because you have access to all the stakeholders who need to make the decisions very quickly to be able to execute to the funding that's coming to you from the federal government or the state government. So great points. You hit home exactly what I experienced last week in my discussion with Cordova.
Certainly the scalability aspect is interesting.
Absolutely.
I know the last year I did some training down in Phoenix in January, and they were smacking up data farms left and right. And these were huge buildings in one of the hottest places in the country. So their energy load, when they discussed it, was ridiculous.
Hottest and driest.
Hottest and driest.
Of interest, so what does all of this translate into? And this is just one comparison, and I have another comparison I'm going to show you. But this market is a comparison of the tier 1 markets across the country. These are the co-location market comparables. But what you see here is that for Greensparc, we're able to effectively go into any of the tier 1 markets if that's what we were really moving towards, and undercut these markets and offer co-location service at least a 20% discount to what other markets are offering. Now, clearly, that's not necessarily the low-hanging fruit for us. I don't need to go tackle Silicon Valley because there's hyperscale data centers, literally, on every other block, it seems like. But, we want to go to those tier 2, tier 3, and beyond. We go to those rural markets that really are underserved or unserved. And so that's a real advantage that we have, and that we think we have over the hyperscalers. There's a question here: how will seismic conditions in some locations be addressed? If we build in Anchorage, we're going to be subject to seismic. If we're building in Fairbanks, we won't. Wherever we go, we can't change the seismic conditions. But what we are willing to do, what's different about us, is that we are willing to consider going where there are seismic conditions. I mean, we're building smaller assets that we're not betting $1 billion if I go to Bethel. I don't have $1 billion riding on the line if I go to Prudhoe Bay. We have a $5 million asset, or a $4 million asset, or a $10 million asset, but that's supported by us identifying that need. So we're not doing anything special to address seismic conditions, but what's different about our operations that we are considering willing to go where the Amazons and the Microsofts will not.
I would remind you, Sam, that you have a 2:00 meeting this afternoon with the state seismologist, Michael West, at the Alaska Earthquake Center. And a couple of topics. One is this one, so really good question, Juanetta. And second, I think you're all aware that Alaska leads the world in the degree to which its land has been sensed, with seismic sensors. And Michael is very, very interested in this use case, small, scalable, local computing. And of course, those guys don't want their bits and bytes heading down to Seattle and all the way back. They can't afford that from a safety and risk management perspective. They need to know what's going on much more quickly. So
when you meet with that guy, you might talk about the recent earthquakes in Salcha Harding Lake area, and the big one that was back in 1937.
Yeah, there is a fault. He knows about that fault line, Jeff. Yep.
Well, and you got to mention that because the mayor of Harding Lake just asked you to.
It has. I found out yesterday. Harding Lake has its own name. So, a couple of more slides, and then I'm happy to take more questions. But this is where we really get to the numbers, right? So, Greensparc co-located at a power plant with a bilateral wholesale agreement with a power producer as station load, for a 0.5 megawatt operation. We're talking about roughly $500,000 a year in energy costs. If we were to do that on a commercial tariff, roughly, double that. And take a look at the PUE factor there. We go from 1.1 in the Greensparc scenarios to your standard HVAC on-grid energy. You're now burning 1.25 megawatts, and your energy cost is is over quadrupled. So this is I'll share with you that this is analysis that I did for a stakeholder that told me, Sam, hey, I have 40 IT closets across the Fairbanks area. I would like to consolidate them. and Sam, I am not going to build a data center in Fairbanks. And I said, you know what? Let me sharpen the pencil and see what we can do. And this was just the energy cost savings, right? That we're projecting. This is what we could do if we took your 40 closets, consolidated them, and put them at a power plant here in the Fairbanks area. This would be just the energy cost savings. The next level of that, the next level of comparison here would be to say, if I also supply you the compute under a contract, similar to like you would order up from an AWS or an Azure, that's Microsoft. I can do it, and we call that bare metal. So bare metal is the infrastructure plus the computing, storage, networking that you need. We would provide it to you in Fairbanks or Anchorage. We could provide it to you in less than 10 miles. The latency on that asset would be less than a millisecond. And for an annual contract for 0.5 megawatt of, for 50 kW of computing, just one cabinet's worth, roughly $500,000 a year. Azure on demand would be charging you $1.6 million, and it would be 2,300 miles away. So just imagine from an economic development perspective, the savings generated, and you're not only the savings generated, but it's money being kept in the state. It's capital being invested in assets locally, and it's a workforce that's being employed somewhere inside the border of Alaska. That's the important part that I think hits home here for this committee and this group. Not just the energy factor, but hey, this is local. This is what local economic development looks like around these kinds of assets. Here's kind of where we're looking at. This is what we've got our eye on now. Obviously, Anchorage and Fairbanks are hubs, but Juneau would be great. Kodiak, Dutch Harbor, Bethel, Prudhoe Bay. We've got a pilot project that we're looking to get deployed here in the next month or two at J-Bear. So we're really excited about that. And every time I come back, and since the pandemic has kind of lightened up a little bit, my first travels, since this pandemic broke, have been coming back to Alaska. But in 3 months, I've been here. I've basically been here every month, it feels like. So I've been up here 3 times in the last 3 months, visiting J-Bear, visiting other stakeholders around Anchorage. Obviously, you heard about my trip to Cordova. And, I can't come to Alaska without swinging home and seeing Dad out in North Pole. So, I always make a long weekend out of it and get up here to Fairbanks and, talk to the folks around town here. And what's common about so far every trip home is, everyone needs infrastructure. Everyone, is talking about what they need and where they need it. And it's great for us because it'll keep us busy. The red dots here on this map are, villages that we've already picked off that we identified as having received funding through the NTIA or USDA programs for broadband expansion. Excuse me. But the point here is we know there are many villages that are applying and receiving funds, and it's not just enough to get the fiber to your village or get the broadband connection. You do need the asset hanging at the end of that line. And so those are natural spots for us to be looking for folks that are going to have a demand for this kind of infrastructure. I think that's kind of the highlight of everything. And I know I've been talking for about a half hour, so I'll pause here for a minute if you guys want to fire questions at me. I'm happy to, field more questions. Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and pull this up if you don't mind, Sam.
We are going to get copies of this presentation, right, Jomo?
You are now, sir.
Thank you.
So I will show this. If anyone's interested, and I'm sure a number of you are. So this is Greensparc's website. You could just Google www.greensparc.com. And there's a lot more and a lot of good information here as well. Okay. And I see Jim shaking his head, nodding his head, so I guess I've done right. Okay. All right. Well, I will open up the floor to questions. Miss Lisa, I would expect that you might have some questions regarding those energy efficiency benefits.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you had mentioned partnerships with the power plants, and obviously there is a power plant in downtown Fairbanks that we may or may not be affiliated with. I guess I'm kind of interested to learn a little bit more about what that would look like.
Lisa, if I could just jump in here, there may or may not be a meeting at 11 o'clock this morning with certain executives from the company that runs that power plant.
Always one step ahead, Jim, one step ahead.
Mr. Hall, I see that you're off mute.
Yeah, and I have to first apologize. I'm learning a lot about this, and actually I've noticed that things have changed since I took Fortran back in the 70s up at the university. It's a different world. And I did look on your website, I guess a couple of things. I did look on your website yesterday to kind of, prompt my mind to start thinking. It looks like you're already, according to the map that I looked at, heavily involved in power plants throughout Alaska, even though it wasn't represented on the map that you just showed a few moments ago. And just to dummy it down, at the end of the day, Mr. Isaacson reaches on out and says, yes, we want to deploy your system. At the end of the result, his communities would have broadband access, internet capabilities at a much greater savings that conventional systems would provide, if I'm just understanding correctly. It seems like there's a tremendous amount of conversation on broadband, and a lot of different entities seem to be wanting to get involved with it and saying we need it. And I'm not denying that it's the world we're in. I guess what I'm thinking is it seems like more, I think there's a question in here somewheres, but more communities and governments are wanting to be involved with it. In Fairbanks, we've been divesting in essentially utilities, which this kind of reminds me of. But am I understanding this correct, I guess is the gist of my question.
I think you've got a handle. You mentioned a lot of stuff. I think you understand the pieces that are on the board. What we've been working hard over the last several years is that I'll tell you that the people in the data world don't understand the energy world either. And there's a lot of education going on our behalf to kind of bring all the stakeholders together to kind of explain to everyone what these efficiencies are. And for as much energy as they burn, when Amazon or Microsoft hire folks to run their energy operations, it's somebody who worked for the utility, but they still don't really understand grid operations of energy and what kind of efficiencies can be driven from that market. It's pretty amazing for as much energy as they do consume. But in my background, and just a quick divergence here, but in grid operations, my company was a scheduling coordinator. So we scheduled power plants to the grid and to their counterparties. And then we did all the real-time settlement of all those energy trades. It was permanent employment because, working on the grid in a place like California or ERCOT or PJM, it's its own special form of black magic almost. The market rules change monthly. There are tweaks here and there. And what that translated to us was we were, constantly on call with our clients to interpret the market, work between them and their other their counterparties on the grid. That is nothing that the data centers ever want to get into. And by the way, we were hired, 15 years ago, my company was hired by the generators to do that business. So that's why we kind of realized we have this really specialized knowledge about what's going on in the grid. We just need to translate that to a bigger stakeholder group that can benefit. And so, and by the way, I passed I forgot to mention the big point of interest for you guys, which is, the power owners. When we go behind the grid with a power plant partner, I'll give you an example like Exelon. Okay, Exelon's one of the largest utilities in the country. They have generation from Texas to Chicago, all the way East Coast and up to the Northeast. And they've got natural gas, they've got coal, they've got nuclear, they've got wind, they've got solar, they've got everything. And they've got a lot of excess capacity. And so they're very interested in monetizing that. So they're taking a resource that they have plenty of, excess generation, and we're helping them monetize that excess generation. Now, when we go behind the meter with our power partner on the grid, and we eliminate half of that energy bill of running a data operation, that's a new margin that I can share with my power partner. So I can provide a power price to them, usually definitely over what the real-time markets might pay them for that excess generation, or if we can pay them more than what they might be currently earning on their PPA with their local utility or whoever their counterparty is. That's a win-win. So in addition to, hey, providing faster, cheaper, greener broadband service to the communities that want and need it, we're a good business partner for our utility partners as well. Now, this is gonna be a case-by-case basis when we get into rural Alaska and rural America. Who wins if we're saving money at a rural electric co-op that also owns all the T&D? There may not be necessarily a benefit to being behind the meter if that same co-op owns all the same, owns the asset and owns the T&D. That might be a wash. But we know from a physical energy perspective, we save energy by parking, at the power plant. But the demand for the broadband service and where fiber terminates in the village also matters. In North America, most power plants on the grid participating in real-time markets need to have a fiber connection from a major carrier to get connected to the grid ISO in their market. So, finding assets on fiber, not a problem. Obviously that'll be a little bit more of a challenge when we go to rural Alaska, but definitely a challenge that we look forward to tackling.
Sam, on that topic, if I could, with regulated utilities such as we have in Alaska, how are you going to be able to do this marginalized additions to, the pricing, the flexible pricing you just talked about?
Yeah.
That's going to be somewhat restricted, won't it?
Great question. And this is something we've thought through in other grids around the country. But if we're in partnership with the energy utility or the power owner, independent power producer, and we're behind the revenue meter, as long as that asset is co-owned or even majority owned on paper to the utility partner, that asset looks like station load to the grid, and it should look like station load to the market.
But then that goes against the governance side of transparency, doesn't it? I mean, somehow RCA is going to be asking some questions, I would think.
From an energy transparency perspective for the data side, we'll be transparent about the fuel type. We'll be transparent about where the energy is coming from and where we're hooked up. But I think on a market by market basis, from Alaska to California to PJM to ERCOT, we'll be addressing. We're going to be working to jump through the right hoops from a regulatory perspective, for sure. Not to say that we have all the answers there, but we'll definitely need to work through the regulatory hurdles.
Yeah, yeah. It's exciting prospects though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve has a good question in the chat. You may not see it, but it says, he asks, how do you handle the outages or poor power quality issues in Alaska?
We're right now we're planning to handle power like a typical data center would, in that we'll have, if you think about, well, maybe you're not familiar with, but data centers on the grid in California or beyond typically have backup generation, and they're taking grid power. We're reversing the equation. We're just hooking up our data center at the generator and potentially taking grid power as the backup. But obviously in rural Alaska, there is no grid power. There is only generation. So, you know, if power's out in a rural village, the entire it's not just data that's going to go down in the village, right? It's the entire village is going to have an issue. So, you know, streaming your Hulu is going to be the last thing they're going to be worried about if the power goes out in Nome. But we're going to be subject to, outages across Alaska, especially in rural communities. But wherever we can be on the grid per se, as it is in Alaska, whether it's rail belt or around Anchorage, you know, we would like to be able to look like station power if the plant has a planned or unplanned outage.
Would this be mitigated by, say, battery backups of some sort?
Yeah, UPS, you typically have an uninterruptible power source for a data operation. That's kind of standard, but usually it's not for hours and hours and hours of operation. It's usually for maybe, 20 to 30 minutes tops to kind of provide an orderly shutdown. Now for a telecom operation like an ACS or a GCI, that's providing voice service over that infrastructure, their governance and their use case is going to drive, well, how long should that uninterruptible power source provide power for? And that is something that we can design in wherever we go. So if it's Cordova Telecom, if it's GCI, if it's ACS, if it's MTA, and we've got a distributed infrastructure, and they say, oh, but Sam, we need X hours of backup, that's fine. The understanding will be, if you have a unique need in your use case that requires, if you have a governance issue that we have to solve, just understand like that, we're billing that through. That's going to be, part of the price tag of the project.
Again, we're talking, a big part of this is scalability. It's the difference between having to do a backup for a relatively small load as opposed to trying to back up some huge facility with massive energy requirements.
Right.
Miss Ayers, I see that you've got your camera on and are off of mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have two questions. I guess the first is, given the distribution of Alaska communities and understanding the scalability of your deployment, have you modeled what sort of an idealized situation, like, for example, Doug has indicated a sort of a regional approach with several small villages. Is that the kind of setup that you're looking for, to partner with a place where you can regionalize and create small microgrids with a consortia of villages?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're working on those models now. We've done a lot of modeling around smaller deployments than obviously 1 megawatt. We've modeled all the way down to 50 kW deployments. I think for a governance perspective, we're thinking about if we're working with a carrier or we're working with whoever's providing the connectivity to the village, like the carrier will probably have their own cabinet for carrier operations. And then we'll probably have 1 or maybe 2 more cabinets that can facilitate other business outside of the carrier cabinet. So it could be, it could be the carrier in one cabinet, the hospital and the state or local government in the second cabinet, and maybe commercial business, edge cloud needs in a third cabinet. But I think that's, and that's something that we'll have to look at on a, village by village basis.
Mm-hmm. And just a follow up to that, how does the expansion of satellite-based broadband factor into your thinking?
It's a great question. Those are stakeholders that are going to need ground stations connected to fiber. So if whatever the 2 or 3 or 4 companies that are looking to provide, broadband to the village via low Earth orbiting satellites, that data goes from the modem in somebody's home or business up to the satellite, and it needs to come down to, guess what? It needs to come down to Fairbanks. It needs to hit a ground station here, and they need a POP, a point of presence, riding on fiber to get back to the continent. So those are key customers that we're looking to serve from infrastructure that we can build in Fairbanks. And one other, and that's a great reminder that I want to throw in, and this is for those of you that are familiar, we're looking to develop as part of the infrastructure that we want to bring to Fairbanks. We would like to deploy here in Fairbanks the first carrier neutral internet exchange point in the state of Alaska. Mm-hmm. That is something that the low Earth orbiting companies asked for. And they said, hey, we can build our POP anywhere in Alaska. All we need is a circuit to the nearest carrier neutral IX. And everyone had to laugh in Alaska because we were like, oh, that means you're going to Seattle. That doesn't make any sense for your model. If they have a carrier neutral IX where traffic can be exchanged across AT&T, ACS, GCI, MTA in a neutral point, Fairbanks is a great case for that. And you'll see the LEOs want to interconnect to the infrastructure that we could offer here in Fairbanks. So we're really excited about the prospect of that. And it means better service for everyone in the state. It means that traffic that needs to be handed off between ACS and GCI can be done in Fairbanks. It doesn't have to trombone all the way down to Seattle and back and add 5,000 miles of latency to whatever internet or cloud operation you're trying to run. So really exciting prospects. And there are folks in other parts of the world that are eager to see an internet exchange point up here in Alaska. And it would be, the first of its kind in the state. So we're super excited to at least be thinking and planning around it.
Yeah, a cleaner, clearer, shorter signal, I think would be, people aren't aware, I think, of what the benefit would be, but once they experience it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks, who don't think about how the internet operates, kind of the point's lost a little bit, but in a business sense, you're all business users. I mean, think about an operation that has to go to bounce off a server in Seattle to get back to you. That's the state of traffic exchange in Alaska.
Yeah, and to that point, I do think that there are sort of micro cases that are interesting in Alaska to consider. One is the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, which obviously instantaneous communication is critical to their operations, and I'm sure they have some workarounds that I'm not aware of, but just thinking about the server farms that are built around Wall Street just to mine microseconds for arbitrage circumstances. And there's at least one case that I'm familiar with in Alaska, which would be McKinley Capital Management, which would have that same kind of need that would be looking to, exploit any kind of time advantage that they could.
The most expensive data center real estate in the world is across the river from Wall Street in New Jersey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Juanetta, there are so many other use cases in Alaska. I was reminded of this one by, you know, Ken and his shirt or sweater there that says Linden on it. I was out in Naknek last spring, and Jim Johnsen took me to the dock there, and there were roughly 1,300, as I recall, something like that, containers sitting out there waiting for the Reds to be processed and loaded to be shipped down to Seattle. And, you know, I'm sitting there in Jim's truck, and I look at their barcodes on every one of those things, and there's a refrigerator unit on every one of those containers. And I just started thinking, data. Can, you know, the purchaser of that fish wants to know that that fish was handled appropriately, right? That it stayed frozen all the way down. And that becomes a very important piece of data that can't depend on long transmission times, right, for the data. It needs to be localized. Now I'm thinking about localized in that case, maybe it's on a big cargo ship. So why not have a small, scalable computing facility right there? So that's another example.
Well, you know, one case in terms of fisheries that has always kind of eluded us, that the fish market and reverse auctions and being able to optimize prices by having that kind of data transmission would be possible, or more possible. One of the things, you know, in looking at, say, for example, a comparison between Vancouver and Alaska, anywhere in Alaska, is that their access to world markets is significantly greater than ours, and they have a market exchange there, which we don't have. And so there are opportunities for commodity market exchanges that I think would be greatly benefit from this kind of data transmission. And I apologize, I have to jump off for 9 o'clock. Thanks for the opportunity.
Hey, thanks everybody for taking time today. I really enjoyed having a chance to kind of share with you our work. And, you know, my contact information is in the deck. So when you get it, if you want to reach out, please feel free to shoot me an email, or, you know, pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm obviously, you know, I'm a Fairbanks kid, so I'm happy to help however I can.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, Jim. Very interesting conversation. And I do hope you'll be circling back around to keep us updated on your progress.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks a million, everybody. Again, Doug, I do have the presentation, so if you want it, I'll try to send it your way. All right. And for everyone else, I just hope you've had well, again, this was really interesting. So have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and we will see you next week.
Take care, all.